Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the philosophy of Antiphon, whom I'm reading out of a Pre-Socratics reader. So Antiphon was a sophist, which means that, like people like Protagoras and Gorgias, he was basically an itinerant teacher of rhetoric. He went around in 5th century BCE Athens, and he taught the art of persuasion to anybody who could pay him to teach them. This was a very lucrative thing at the time, as I've talked about in other videos on the Sophists, because Athenian democracy depended on being able to persuade people to agree with you. Whereas Protagoras and Gorgias were not super concerned about the idea of truth, with Protagoras, according to Aristotle, who is not a fan of the Sophists, whereas Protagoras, according to Aristotle, said that rhetoric is to make the weaker argument the stronger. Antiphon really sort of undercuts. Antiphon is in this same vein, right? But I'd say he goes a little bit further than Protagoras or Gorgias in undercutting objectivity, and when I mean objectivity, I mean the idea that like there's an objective moral standard and objective truth, things like this. And Gorgias is clearly with his various bits and pieces, particularly his sort of long quasi-metaphysical argument that I had talked about in the video about him. Clearly not sold on the idea of an objective truth, but okay, so I guess the clearest way I can sort of articulate the difference, what Antiphon adds is a legal focus to this, right? That he makes this argument for a distinction between natural law and human law, and essentially argues that you don't really have to worry about human law unless you're going to get caught violating it. So what he says in this fairly lengthy passage, justice is a matter of not transgressing what the laws prescribe in whatever city you are a citizen of. A person would make most advantage of justice for himself if he treated the laws as important in the presence of witnesses, and treated the decrees of nature as important when alone and with no witnesses present. For the decrees of law are extra additions, those of nature are necessary. Those of the law are the products of agreement, not of natural growth, whereas those of nature are the products of natural growth, not of agreement. If those who made the agreement do not notice a person transgressing the prescription of laws, he is free from both disgrace and penalty, but not so if they do notice him. But if, contrary to possibility, anyone violates any of the things which are innate by nature, the evil is no less if no one notices him, and no greater if all observes. For he does not suffer harm as a result of opinion, but as a result of truth. Now, this is a very interesting bit. This is actually the first paragraph of 5 fairly lengthy paragraphs in this fragment. But this sets up this really interesting idea, right? And of course, the interconnections between nature and society are major philosophical questions that still get discussed to this day. But this is kind of one might say a pragmatic criminal's approach to the question of law, because what Antiphon is saying here essentially is you have to obey natural law. You don't really have a choice about that. But whether or not you obey human laws, you have more of a choice about. So this is what the interesting thing is, right? This idea that you only need to obey human laws when there are witnesses. If you steal something in violation of the law of the city-state that you live in, but no one sees you, then it's not a problem. Or if no one is aware of the crime, it's not a problem. This connects to the sort of larger philosophical ideas of the Sophists, which is that truth is secondary to persuasive ability, and that is a very pragmatic, practical approach to information, to argument, to life, in a way. Whereas people like Socrates insist in a knowable, objective, philosophical truth, the Sophists do not. And one of the upshots of that, if you sort of apply that logic practically, is the laws of the city-state are only bind you if you can't get away with breaking them. Right? This is a very pragmatic approach. You can commit crimes, and if no one knows, then you aren't penalized. It is therefore as though you did not commit a crime. So, I mean, this does sort of, again, assume a degree of like victimless crime. This notion of whether or not I can get away with it is the only thing that's important, and not whether or not I have done something unjust to someone else. But the thing that Antiphon then goes on to say is another really interesting philosophical issue, again, about the relationship between social or human law and natural law. Because he puts them at odds with one another. He sets them up almost as in innate opposition to one another. So he says, this is the entire purpose of considering these matters, that most of the things that are just according to law are established in a way which is hostile to nature. For laws have been established for the eyes as to what they must see and what they must not, and for the ears as to what they must hear and what they must not, and for the tongue as to what it must say and what it must not, and for the hands as to what they must do and what they must not, and for the feet as to where they must go and where they must not, and for the mind as to what it must desire and what it must not. Now, the things from which the laws deter humans are no more in accord with or suited to nature than the things which they promote. There's a big difference for Antiphon between natural law, what we do according to human nature, which is, of course, a philosophically slippery concept, and what is legal in the socio-cultural and judicial sense. And I want to connect this to another passage a little bit later on. Where he says, but according to law, those are correct who defend themselves after suffering and are not first to do wrong, and those who do good to parents who are bad to them, and who permit others to accuse them on oath, but do not themselves accuse on oath. You will find most of these cases hostile to nature. They permit people to suffer more pain when less is possible, and to have less pleasure when more is possible, and to receive injury when it is not necessary. Now that gets really interesting if you know your Nietzsche. So Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century came up with this idea of the Übermensch, or the Superman, as it's sometimes translated into English. This was a person who embraced life as opposed to the constrictions of society, particularly a Judeo-Christian society, which Nietzsche felt was built on a morality of slavery. And the Übermensch transcended that. The Übermensch was not constrained by social norms, by laws of decorum, by rules, whatever it was. The Übermensch followed because this is the 18th century, or the 19th century, sorry. The Übermensch followed his natural inclinations. He embraced life, and he did so regardless of the consequences for himself or others. Antiphon is anticipating this idea that the laws of society constrict human beings, human behavior, and enforce the experience of suffering in ways that are not, strictly speaking, necessary, right? So Antiphon is prefiguring Nietzsche in some sense, where he says it is the laws of nature are superior to the laws of man because they allow us to embrace life rather than to constrict it. It's a very interesting, again, prefiguration of this sort of Nietzschean idea of the Übermensch, who is not bound by these restrictions and instead sort of embraces his full power and potentiality.